Muy buenos días, estimados hermanos y amigos. Una vez más estamos aquí con ustedes con deseo de saludarles en el nombre admirable, nombre glorioso, nombre sublime, el nombre de nuestro gran Dios y Salvador Jesucristo, el Señor. Esto es Sembrando con Fe y Esperanza. Bienvenidos.
Chapter 3. Is the New Testament historically reliable? 1. Tests for the reliability of historical documents, including the New Testament. In this chapter, we are presenting evidence for the historical reliability of the Scripture, not its inspiration. The historical reliability of the Bible should be tested by the same criteria by which all historical documents are tested. Because the Christian faith is inextricably connected to specific events of real history, many people who are curious to evaluate what Christianity is all about find that the historical reliability of its documents makes an appropriate starting point for them in their search for truth. Donald Hagner, Professor Emeritus of New Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary, explains the connection between the Christian faith and real historical events with great clarity. True Christianity, the Christianity of the New Testament documents, is absolutely dependent on history, including its manuscript attestation. At the heart of the New Testament faith is the assertion that God was in Christ reconciling the world to himself, 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 19. The incarnation, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ as a real event in time and space, that is, as historical realities, are the indispensable foundations of the Christian faith. To my mind, then, Christianity is best defined as the recitation of, the celebration of, and the participation in God's acts in history, which, as the New Testament writing emphasize, have found their culmination in Jesus Christ. There are specific tests that scholars, researchers, and archaeologists use to determine the authenticity of a historical document. These are the bibliographical test, the internal evidence test, and the external evidence test. Scholar Chauncey Sanders lists and explains these three basic principles of historiography in his Introduction to Research in English Literary History. In this chapter, we will examine the New Testament portion of the Bible to see how well it does with each test in order to determine its reliability as an accurate source for the historical events it reports. Because the original autographs of the New Testament books have not been found, most of this chapter will examine the historicity of the early manuscript, handwritten copies that were made from them, concentrating upon the bibliographic test. However, to begin, we will survey what is known about how those first original writings fit into history, the likely dates at which they were written, and the correspondence of their references to historical events, persons, and cultural details that historians trust as verified by external sources. 2. Dating the four Gospels and Acts. When scholars assign dates to manuscripts, we find that those dates sometimes vary not just by a few years or even decades, but even by centuries. Why is this? One major reason is the worldview and consequent presuppositions that scholars and researchers bring to their study of the writer's references to history, along with the content and language patterns of the text. To estimate the dates the manuscripts were created, all these come into play. Conservative scholars date the writing of the New Testament earlier than do liberal scholars. We present below two lists that illustrate the differences. Then, for each of the four Gospels, we provide additional details and sources. Conservative dating: Matthew, early 60s to 80. Mark, late 50s to late 60s. Luke, early 60s to 80s. John, mid 60s to 100. Acts, 62 to 64. Liberal dating: Matthew, 80 to 100, Mark, 70s, Luke, 70 to 110, John, 90 to 100, letters attributed to Paul, 50 to early 2nd century. A. Matthew, early 60s to 80, liberal dating, 80 to 100 AD. The date of Matthew's writing can be deduced from this report by Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father who said that Matthew composed his gospel while Peter and Paul were preaching the gospel and founding the church in Rome. The only time that we know of Peter and Paul together in the capital of the Roman Empire was the early to mid-60s. There are some who reject the idea that Matthew wrote during this time. One reason is that Matthew records Jesus predicting the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, which happened in AD 70. Matthew chapter 24, verses 1 and 2. They argue that Matthew must have been written after the event because predictive prophecy like this is not possible. They do this because they hold an anti-supernatural worldview. If it can be demonstrated that supernatural events can occur, which is one of this book's objectives, then their argument does not hold up. Another reason for proposing a later date relates to Matthew's record of the tensions between Pharisaic Judaism and Christian Judaism. Some would argue that these tensions primarily reflect the latter half of the first century, during the war with Rome, which left these two groups as the only two surviving forms of Judaism. However, this is not a strong argument, as the tensions had already started in the 60s. Furthermore, Matthew also records tensions between Jesus and the Sadducees and other leaders, not just the Pharisees. A third reason for proposing a later date for Matthew is that Matthew was most likely written after Mark, and Mark was supposedly written in the 70s or just before then. However, Mark could well have been written in the later 50s or 60s, in which case there is no problem. B. Mark, late 50s to late 60s, liberal dating 70s. Mark was a bilingual Hellenist, John being his Hebrew name and Mark his Greek one, and relative of the wealthy Cyprian landowner Barnabas, Colossians chapter 4 verse 10, compare Acts chapter 4 verse 36. John Mark's well-to-do family occupied a significant place in early Christian communities, first in Jerusalem and later in Antioch. His mother's substantial house provided a gathering point for believers in Jerusalem and was the first port of call for a recently escaped Peter, Acts chapter 12, verses 12 through 16, who, when writing later from Rome, described Mark as "my son," 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. Mark joined his cousin Barnabas and Paul in their early travels from Antioch, Acts chapter 12, verse 25, and chapter 13, verses 2 and 3, and in spite of a falling out, Acts chapter 13, verse 13, and chapter 15, verses 36 through 39, later worked closely with Paul, Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, Philemon, verse 24, even being summoned to Paul's last imprisonment also in Rome, 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. John Mark was therefore well placed to write his gospel. The great bulk of his oral material would have come through his regular contact with Peter, with perhaps his mother's female friends providing the information for which they are explicitly named, the events surrounding the empty tomb, chapter 15, verse 40 through chapter 16, verse 8. Equally, some of his insights into Jesus' significance may well have come from Paul, to whom Jesus later appeared. Compare 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 8. The book of Mark is notoriously difficult to date. According to early church tradition, Mark was an associate of Peter. This is supported by the considerable amount of attention which the Gospel of Mark gives to Peter, and the fact that Peter is mentioned near the beginning and the end of the narrative. Mark chapter 1 verse 16 and chapter 16 verse 7, perhaps pointing back to the witness of Peter, the source of Mark's content. If this is the case, Mark would most likely have written before Peter was martyred, circa 64, or shortly thereafter. According to Donald Hagner, we may tentatively opt for a date of about 65, shortly after the death of Peter. This places the initial readers in a time when they would have been subject to persecution, which would make sense of that significant motif in this gospel. Mark may be placed earlier if we rely on much of early church tradition that states that the gospel was written while Peter was still living. Hagner mentions that Mark may have even died before Peter did. Later in this chapter, we will argue in favor of J.P. Moreland's view that Acts was written between AD 62 and 64. He believes that the Gospel of Luke was written before Acts and that Luke likely used Mark as a source for his biography, thus placing Mark even earlier. C. Luke, early 60s to 80s, liberal dating 70 to 110. The Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts are often referred to together as Luke-Acts because Luke wrote both of these accounts, probably not far apart from each other. Although the date of Luke continues to be debated, there is a general consensus that Luke wrote his Gospel before Acts and after Mark. Those who insist on a pre-AD 70 date note that Luke does not describe Paul's death, mid-60s, in Acts or show an awareness of Paul's letters. Those who argue for a date after AD 70 respond by pointing out that Luke was not writing a biography of Paul, but an account of the progress of the gospel, and although Luke does not explicitly quote from Paul's letters, his writings do reflect the influence of Paul's thought. Next, we will present reasons that support a pre-70 date for the book of Acts. D. Acts. The best estimate for the dating of Acts places the work between AD 62 and 64. J.P. Moreland lists several reasons why Acts should be given this early date. Luke shows a particular interest in the city of Jerusalem. He mentions the city about 30 times in the Gospel of Luke and about 60 times in the book of Acts, which is far more than any other New Testament writer does. Acts reports many events that took place in Jerusalem from the day of Pentecost to the imprisonment of Paul. Yet Luke fails to mention one of the most important events to have ever happened in the city, the destruction of the temple in AD 70. It makes sense, then, to date the book of Acts before the temple was destroyed. Acts does not mention the severe persecutions of the Roman Emperor Nero, which started in the mid-60s. Again, Luke would probably have recorded this dark time of Christendom had he written his book during or after those persecutions. Luke records the martyrdoms of Stephen and James, the brother of John, but he is silent about the martyrdoms of Peter, Paul, and James. These three prominent figures in the book of Acts died between AD 61 and 67. If Luke wrote Acts after their deaths, he would probably have heard about their martyrdoms and included them in his history of the early church. One of the major themes in the book of Acts is the way in which the early church leaders welcomed new Gentile believers and included them in the growing communities of Christians. The leaders also specified how the Gentile Christians should relate to Jewish believers. Moreland points out that this was a very important matter before the destruction of the temple in AD 70, but much less important after the destruction. Acts also deals with other subjects that fit most naturally into the years prior to the destruction of the temple in AD 70, such as different people groups, Jewish, Samaritan, Gentile, receiving the Holy Spirit, and the divisions between Palestinian Jews and Hellenistic Jews. Thus, we can make the case that Luke wrote before the temple's destruction, staying relevant to the issues of his time. Several distinctively Jewish expressions used throughout the book of Acts indicate a pre-70 Jewish Christian audience. If the book of Acts was originally intended for the increasingly Gentile church of later decades, the author would have adjusted his vocabulary and phrasing to accommodate them. According to Moreland, the phrases "the Son of Man," "the Servant of God" applied to Jesus, "the first day of the week," the resurrection, and "the people," the Jews, are all phrases that readers would understand without explanation prior to 70. After 70, they would need to be explained. Luke does not mention the wars against the Romans beginning in AD 66. Once again, the most logical explanation for Luke's silence about such important events in Jewish history is that he wrote Acts before they all began. Moreland sums up, "But this means that Luke should be dated just prior to the wars against the Romans. Further, Matthew and Mark should be dated even earlier, perhaps from the mid-40s to mid-50s. The picture of Jesus presented in the Synoptics is one that is only 12 to 29 years removed from the events themselves, and they incorporate sources which are even earlier. In conclusion, a very strong case can be made to date the composition of Acts in the early 60s. This in turn provides a reference point that historians can use to date the three synoptic Gospels that preceded the book of Acts. E. John, mid-60s to 100, liberal dating 90 to 100. There is a wide possible time frame for the date of John's writing and very little support for any specific time period within the 60s to 100 time frame. Almost any date between about AD 55 and 95 is possible. None of the arguments for a more precise date is entirely convincing. But if we must suggest a date for when John wrote the fourth Gospel, we may very tentatively advance AD 80 to 85. One of many reasons for this is to allow for some time between the writing of John's Gospel and the writing of his three letters, which were probably written in the early 90s, and which combat an incipient form of Gnosticism and respond in part to a Gnostic misunderstanding of the fourth Gospel. However, because of John's emphasis on Jesus as the divine Son of God, many liberal scholars have given John a later date, supposing that such a high view of Jesus' divinity did not form until later in history when legend took over. As mentioned above, another plausible hypothesis is that John's Gospel was written shortly before his letters, which were likely written in the 90s in response to pseudo-Gnostic misinterpretations of his Gospel. This estimate places John's Gospel somewhere in the 80s. However, leading Bible scholar and translator Daniel Wallace dates John's Gospel to the mid-60s. F. Conclusion regarding the dating of the Gospels and Acts. It can be reasonably argued that all four biographies of Jesus in the New Testament, as well as the book of Acts, were written within a few decades and certainly within a century of the events they describe. Even most non-Christian scholars acknowledge this and place the canonical Gospels and Acts securely within the first century. Nevertheless, even if a radically late dating were correct, we would still have records for the events surrounding the origin of Christianity that are earlier than those sometimes used to support unquestioned events in history. 3. The bibliographical test for the reliability of the New Testament. The bibliographical test is an examination of the textual transmission by which documents reach us. In other words, since we do not have the original documents, how reliable are the copies we have in regard to the number of manuscripts? And the time interval between the original and extant, currently existing copies. For any particular work or collection of works, the greater the number and the earlier the dating of the manuscripts, the easier it is to reconstruct a text closer to the original and identify errors or discrepancies in subsequent copies. The importance of the sheer number of manuscripts and early patristic quotations of Scripture cannot be overstated. As with other documents of ancient literature, there are no known extant original manuscripts of the Bible. Fortunately, however, the abundance of manuscript copies makes it possible to reconstruct the original text with virtually complete accuracy. Peters states that, on the basis of manuscript tradition alone, the works that made up the Christians' New Testament were the most frequently copied and widely circulated books of antiquity. The authenticity of the New Testament text we have today rests on a foundation of a massive amount of historical documentation. A. The number of manuscripts and their closeness to the original. How many manuscripts of the New Testament do we have today? It is a very large number that has not remained static. It grows even larger as new discoveries are made. Accordingly, researchers and historians are constantly revising their estimates. Without question, the New Testament boasts the best attested manuscript transmission when compared with other ancient documents. The bibliographical test validates and confirms that the New Testament has been accurately transmitted to us through the centuries. It is extremely laborious to track the number of both classical and biblical manuscripts. Many scholars base the number of New Testament manuscripts on the work of Kurt Aland and Barbara Aland of the Institute for New Testament Textual Research in Münster, Germany. Another great source for manuscript study is the Leuven database, available online at www.trismegistos.org/LDAB/. Yet another is the Center for the Study of the New Testament Manuscripts, www.csntm.org. 4 challenges face anyone hoping to estimate the number of New Testament manuscripts. 1. Databases do not always reflect new discoveries. 2. Most databases do not include the many manuscripts in private collections. 3. Most databases do not include the scrolls. And 4. Most databases do not account for manuscripts that date from the Renaissance or later. Scrolls were made by gluing papyrus sheets together or sewing parchment sheets together and then winding either of these onto a rod or stick, as opposed to single-sheet fragments or to a codex, which is produced by stacking sheets and carefully sewing them together along one edge. For more information on the materials and processes of manuscript preparation, see our chapter on How We Got the Bible. We will now list the surviving manuscripts of various languages into which the New Testament was first translated. It is important to understand that these numbers are constantly changing as new manuscript discoveries come to light. There are so many changes that by the time anything is printed, the numbers may have changed drastically. That is why regularly updated online databases are so valuable in this particular field of study. B. Counting and dating the early New Testament manuscripts. 1. Greek. Earliest manuscript AD 130. The earliest verified New Testament Greek manuscript is the John Rylands Papyrus of John, known by the designation P52, which New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman dates to 125 to 130, plus or minus 25 years. If you ever go to Manchester, England, make sure to stop at the John Rylands Library where this ancient document is being preserved. It is a great experience. As far as I, Josh, have been able to find, there is no other manuscript besides P52 to have been officially recognized as the earliest manuscript of the New Testament, although recent discoveries have produced possible contenders. A recently discovered portion of a Mark manuscript may date as early as circa AD 85 to 125. However, we must wait for this discovery to go through peer review and publishing before we can establish the dating of this portion with more certainty. Number of manuscripts, circa 5,856. The current number, according to the Institut für Neutestamentliche Textforschung, Institute for New Testament Textual Research, hereafter the INTTR, in Münster, Germany, the official cataloger of Greek New Testament manuscripts, is circa 5,856. This includes papyri, majuscules, minuscules, and lectionaries. For more information about these manuscript types, see Chapter 2. According to their tally from January 2017, minuscules equals 2,937, majuscules, uncials, equals 323, papyri equals 131, lectionaries equals 2,465, for a total of 5,856. The official number of 5,856 requires some revision, however. One should deduct manuscripts that have gone missing, those that have been destroyed, and those that have been discovered to be a part of a known manuscript. According to Wallace, the adjusted numbers as of January 2017 are now well over 5,600. Yet one could also add to that number the many, possibly hundreds, of manuscripts in private collections that have never been published. Additionally, discoveries made in recent years have not been factored into the official count. In the words of Wallace, the multitude of new discoveries of Greek biblical manuscripts are like a literary tsunami. 2. Armenian. Earliest manuscript, AD 862. AAS 10-Kate mentions that the oldest Armenian manuscript is the Gospel of Queen Milke, dated to AD 862. Number of manuscripts, 3,000 plus. Crow mentions a catalog of scriptural holdings which lists 207 full Bibles, 150 New Testaments, and 3,003 Gospel books. That makes a total of 3,325 New Testament manuscripts. 3. Coptic. The Coptic language is the last stage of the written Egyptian language. It came about when the Greeks conquered Egypt and their languages merged to form Coptic. The sounds of the Egyptian language hieroglyphics were transliterated with Greek letters, not words, which makes it easy to misidentify a Coptic text as Greek. Earliest manuscript, late 3rd century AD. Number of manuscripts, 10-Kate says there are circa 975. Others estimate a larger number. Probably at least 1,000 Coptic manuscripts exist, representative of the Alexandrian text type. In early December 2013, I, Josh, hosted 274 scholars, apologists, and leaders from 4 countries for a 2-day event in Dallas, Texas, to examine ancient manuscript fragments. We were thrilled to share in the discovery of a very significant papyrus, 2 fragments from the Sermon on the Mount. It is possible that this will be validated as the earliest papyri known of that passage from the Gospel of Matthew. The preliminary examination of these fragments dates them approximately AD 350 to 430. However, no one should consider this estimate to be authoritative at this time. We need to wait until the scientific analysis and publication of these findings is complete, which could take another 2 to 4 years. Those Coptic manuscript fragments discovered on that December weekend are in my, Josh's, possession and are awaiting further research and publication. Here is the list of all the Coptic biblical fragments that were discovered at the event. It appears that these newly discovered Coptic manuscripts will prove to be the oldest discovered of these passages. Matthew chapter 6 verse 33, Matthew chapter 7 verse 4, reverse side. Matthew chapter 15 verse 9, John chapter 14 verse 28, Galatians chapter 4 verse 17, 1 John chapter 2 verse 21, AD 350 to 430, Jeremiah chapter 33 verse 24. 4. Gothic. Earliest manuscript 5th or 6th century AD. Number of manuscripts 6. Bible scholars Bruce Metzger and Bart Ehrman comment, the most nearly complete of the half-dozen extant Gothic manuscripts, all of which are fragmentary, is a deluxe copy dating from the 5th or 6th century. It contains portions of all 4 Gospels. It is worth noting that these Gothic translations, though fragmentary, are a word-by-word translation, so they can be particularly useful. 5. Ethiopian. Earliest manuscript, 6th century AD. The oldest known Ethiopic manuscripts known are 2 Abba Garima Gospels recently dated to the 6th century. Number of manuscripts, 600 plus. George Fox University professor Steve Delamarter directs the Ethiopic Manuscript Imaging Project. He summarizes the status of Ethiopian manuscripts. Outside of Ethiopia, there are about 600 Ethiopic manuscripts that contain the text of one or more books of the New Testament. Delamarter continues, within Ethiopia there are perhaps 5,000 yet to be discovered and catalogued. Among these are undoubtedly several hundred from the 17th century and earlier. Although most Ethiopic manuscripts have been assigned fairly recent dates, at least one manuscript of the 4 Gospels dates to the 10th century and a couple of others date to the 11th century. 6. Latin translations. Latin translations are typically divided into Old Latin and Vulgate manuscripts. The total number of Latin manuscripts is 10,050 plus. Old Latin, earliest manuscript, 4th century AD. Number of manuscripts, 110. H.A.G. Houghton's carefully numbered count of 110 includes all the manuscripts from the Vestis Latina Register, supplements the register with a few other lists, and even adds new discoveries. However, it should be noted that this count probably contains some overlap with the Vulgate, see next section, as some manuscripts contain elements of the Vulgate as well as Old Latin. VL 109 is one such example. Vestis Latina director Roger Greisen catalogues 89 Old Latin manuscripts of the New Testament, dating from the 4th to the 13th centuries. Additionally, Old Latin manuscripts are counted differently from most other manuscripts in that a single parchment that contains, say, the Gospel of Matthew and Ephesians is counted as 2 manuscripts. Therefore, a count of 50 manuscripts is a more accurate apples-to-apples comparison. Latin Vulgate, earliest manuscript, 4th century AD. Number of manuscripts, 10,000 plus. We have to be careful here as there is no database that collects all the known manuscripts of the Vulgate. Many sources will mention that there are more than 10,000. Houghton says that probably no one really knows exactly how many. It is at least 4,000. The figure of 10,000 is still regularly bandied about, but I suspect that is because no one else has any clue either, and it sounds plausible. One day I hope to get funding to make a database of as many as are known to exist. Then we might be able to come up with a better figure. Until then, you can stick with over 10,000. 7. Syriac. Syriac is the name generally given to Christian Aramaic. From its inception, Christianity has been a missionary faith. The earliest versions of the New Testament were prepared by missionaries to assist in the propagation of the Christian faith among peoples whose native tongue was Syriac, Latin, or Coptic. Earliest manuscript, late 4th or early 5th century AD. Syriac Peshitta. The basic meaning of Peshitta is simple. It was the standard version produced around AD 150 to 250. There are more than 350 manuscripts from the 5th century extant. Palestinian Syriac. Most scholars date this version at about AD 400 to 450, 5th century. Philoxenian, AD 508. Polycarp translated a new Syriac New Testament for Philoxenus, Bishop of Maybug. Harkleian Syriac, by Thomas of Harkel. Number of manuscripts, 350 plus. Old Syriac, 2 manuscripts. There are around 60 in the 5th and 6th centuries alone. The earliest known translation of the Greek New Testament is in the Peshitta, the official Bible of the Syriac-speaking church. The New Testament portion was probably written before AD 400, making it a significant witness to the original Greek text. Syker estimates the manuscripts at more than 350. However, Wallace states, the surviving copies of the Syriac New Testament manuscripts number in the hundreds, perhaps thousands. Scholar Andreas Yukel notes, most of the existing lists and catalogs are out of date, new acquisitions are not properly recorded, and up-to-date catalogs are delayed. For example, Princeton University, Speer Library, Moscow, St. Petersburg. There are a lot of manuscripts in private possession, USA and Canada, and in uncatalogued libraries in the Middle East, Lebanon. The catalogued ones in the Middle East, Syria, Iraq, had to be removed or split and suffered severe losses, so nobody is able to count. He continues, it is possible to give an idea about the dimension only. Certainly more than 1,000 Syriac manuscripts, including New Testament texts and written before World War I, exist, but hardly more than 1,500. 8. Georgian. Earliest manuscript, 5th century AD. A few fragments survive from this period. Number of manuscripts, 89. The 60 oldest ones are fragments. Several later manuscripts are more extensive. 9. Slavic. Earliest manuscript, 10th to 11th century AD. Number of manuscripts, 4,000 plus. Krasovic mentions 89 manuscript entries. University of Indiana professor Henry Cooper writes, the most thorough description of the manuscript holdings of a Slavic country to date, conducted in 1965 on the territory of the then Soviet Union, yielded in all about 1,500 entries dating before the 15th century. More than 99% of these manuscripts were translations, usually from Greek, and the vast majority of those were of biblical books, especially portions of the Gospels and the Psalms. Cooper adds that account for the 15th century added 3,500 more entries. On the higher end, St. Petersburg University professor Anatoly Alexeyev writes that, for the first time in the history of Slavistics, the number of selected Gospel manuscripts has reached the significant figure of over 1,100. Cooper suggests that Alexeyev's higher numbers could be so, it seems to me, only if one included 16th and 17th century Slavonic manuscripts. Manuscript production in the Slavic world continued long after the introduction of printing in Western, Central, and Southeastern Europe. In any event, the later Slavonic manuscripts are of marginal value in tracing the development of the Church Slavonic Bible. 10. Summary. Wallace concludes that, all told, probably between 15 and 20,000 texts of the ancient versions of the New Testament remain. There are no exact numbers because not all the manuscripts have been carefully catalogued. This audiobook is continued on Disc 6.
La Iglesia Pentecostal Unida Latinoamericana en Baltimore nos estamos reuniendo en la 8301 Liberty Road, 8301 Liberty Road, Windsor Mill, Maryland 21244. Y nuestras reuniones son los días domingo a las 8 de la mañana. Domingo 8 de la mañana tenemos el servicio de adoración, alabanza y enseñanza de la palabra de Dios. Venga juntamente con su familia y allegados. Serán todos bienvenidos a nuestra reunión dominical. Recuerde, Jesucristo es el verdadero Dios y la vida eterna. Primera de Juan 5:20. Y si otros días madrugamos a buscar la comida que perece, ¿por qué no hacerlo el día domingo para buscar la comida que a vida eterna permanece? Le esperamos.